So today we're going to take a look at restoring my 1974 Honda QA50 mini bike. This bike has been stored up in the second floor of my shop forever, and in the springtime I decided to pull it down and actually start the restoration. I've got another video that kind of shows this same process, but here we are with me getting it out of my loft, bringing it down to actually take a look at it, assess it, and see what we need to do. Now, the reason I have this bike is because I didn't have one when I was a kid, and it's responsible for every other motorcycle I have because I wanted one so badly. Here it is coming down, and taking a look at it up on the bench. It's in decent shape, but it's been fooled with. The engine has been spray painted without having been apart. The forks have been spray painted. There's overspray on the fork boots. The tires are shot. The exhaust system looks terrible. The fenders are cracked. The gas tank we're going to see later has got a couple of pretty good dents in it. But for the most part, it's a decent start. Everything is there except for the air filter, and I've been looking to try to get one of those and haven't been too successful yet. So, like anything, strip the whole thing down, and when I say the whole thing, every single piece comes apart, including the engine. Here we're taking a look at the paint on the frame. I don't think the frame was ever fooled with. And my original plans were to bead blast it. I was going to bead blast the forks, of course, and I did. But I was going to strip that frame down and repaint the whole thing. It's interesting, when I took out the steering head, there's supposed to be 21 bearings, top and bottom. I only ended up with a total of 36. So whoever put it back together didn't put those all in there. You can see the pieces of the engine there on the bench, the cylinder head, the valve in the bore itself. The valve train is on the bench next to that. Yeah, there's the valve parts waiting to get cleaned up. And then here's the engine cases after taking it apart. They were a mess. I bead blasted those, primed them with self-etching primer, and then painted them with Eastwood Alumablast paint. I did not use Honda Cloud Silver. I like the way this comes out. And again, this is a backyard restoration, not a professional restoration. Although I do take some pride in the quality of my work. So that case came out fantastic. You can see me prepping the one behind it to get to the point where I can actually paint it as well. And that Eastwood paint is very durable. Let's take a look at... Okay, so here's how I actually prep the engine cases after paint stripper. I use this tool that I have from Eastwood. It's called a Contour SCT with an abrasive pad, and it does a really good job at both scuffing up the surface and removing what's left of the paint. So spend a little bit of time doing that, and then you go over it a little bit more with a Dremel tool for places that you missed. And then finally, once all that's done, some sandpaper, and then self-etching primer, and then finally the Eastwood paint. Here's the center case. The center cases are not supposed to be painted, and in this case, like I said, the previous owner had spray painted the entire engine. So really what I need to do here is just strip the paint off of it and clean up that case a little bit so that the bare metal actually looks good. That's the way it would have come from the factory. And there you can see the rest of the engine. These videos are a little bit out of order, but you can see the level of it coming apart. Now here's the transmission pawl, or the actual shifter, and you can see I have two of those there. Interesting, because I ended up with almost two bikes when I started this one. So this one did have a second gear shifting problem. And one of the things I did was make sure that that little shifter there actually will move all the way forward in that slot. As they come configured from the factory, they don't. So basically you have to take it out, and a little work on the grinding wheel to kind of round off those corners. And once you do that, then that slot, that piece will actually fit in the slot correctly, moves all the way up, and that will engage second gear and hold it there. So I took the better of my two transmissions and did that work, and you can see when it's done, that piece slides all the way up in there now. It doesn't get stuck on the corners where it used to get stuck before. And that was the primary reason that I took this engine apart. It was running reasonably well. But then again, to paint it, you have to take it apart to paint it right. And then I figured while I'm in there, let me take a look at everything else, all the bearings, the clutch, and ensure that when I put this back together that it's going to be good for another 45 or 50 years. So I was pretty satisfied with that. I did have some other pieces, and kind of drove me crazy when I was putting the engine back together because I left one of the spare transmission pieces laying around, and got the whole engine back together and was wondering, all right, where does this one little shim go? And didn't realize that what I'm holding is an extra shim. In fact, you can see it there it just went by in the video. So here's a sped up view of putting that bottom end of the engine back together. If you take a look at my channel, I've got another video that details the bottom end assembly from start to finish. If you want to see how to do it, it's relatively straightforward. Here you can see that center case, or I think that's the left-hand side case, is where you start. Everything is very clean, and you just have to take your time and do it carefully. I use assembly lube from Lucas Oil when I do this kind of work to hold things in place and to make sure that you've got the right amount of lubrication there the first time you start the bike up. Works really well. New gaskets, of course. And you just got to be careful when you're putting the three halves of the engine together to make sure that everything seats properly. And there you go. That's exactly what it looks like when things seat properly. And there's a better look at what that center case looks like without any paint on it. Now, when you look at that, you might say, well, geez, Chris, that could be better. Brand new looks better than that. But this was, again, not sent out to be a perfect restoration. I just wanted it to be, to look like close to what it did when it was new. But, I don't want this to be a bike that when it's done, I'm afraid to ride or I'm afraid to get a little bit dirty. So there's parts of the original bike that I used intact, although I polished and cleaned everything up. If you were to go and have a professional do this, they would replace, in most cases, or rebuild every single part of the bike so it looks exactly the way it did when you rolled it off the showroom floor. Here's what my wheels and tires look like before I started. Tires were original, but nothing left of them. And you can see the hub assemblies are dirty, rusty, and need a lot of work. So I think I have another video that I posted in terms of how to actually get these apart, how to break the bead. You can see once you do, they're pretty messed up on the inside. There's the original tube from the other tire. And the process is the same with these. So take it all the way apart, take the junky old bearings out and throw them away. Throw away the brake shoes, which I think you're going to see later on in the video. Bead blast everything, and then prime it all, paint it all, and do what you can with the hardware. I was able to reuse most of the hardware from the bike. Here's what the brake backing plates look like, and oh, look at those fantastic brake shoes. And to think that I was considering leaving this bike the way it was and just riding it around. That's why on an old bike like this, you got to take it apart and look at it. So these were a mess. Dirty, crappy, all kinds of junk on there. I do have another video that I show in detail how you clean these things up, but it's a very similar process. I clean them first. Sometimes they're clear coated. I'm not sure if these were, but I hit them with paint stripper anyway. Basically sand them down and polish them, and they come out fantastic. In fact, they came out looking like new. So here's one of those hubs ready to go back together. You can see that I've primed it and painted it, in this case, and I think this is Eastwood silver aluminum wheel paint. There's the spacer that goes in there. And of course, if you're going to go through all of this trouble, make sure you replace the bearings. There's the new bearings ready to go in. They're, not expensive, and it makes a world of difference. The ones that came out were so far gone that it's amazing the bike even rolled. And they're very easy to put in. I typically put them in the freezer first, inside their bags. Put them in the freezer for about 30 minutes, and they'll shrink just a tiny little bit. And then to put them in, you can either use a bearing driver or, every mechanic's friend, a socket of about the right size. You want to make sure with that socket that you're pressing on the outer edge of that bearing. Don't push on the inside. Don't push on the blue part there. And then make sure your socket is small enough so that when you drive that bearing down in, you can get the socket back out. That's a 24 millimeter, I believe, diameter bearing. A 24 millimeter socket is too big. So what you want to do, I think I ended up with a 15/16 socket, and drove that right down, and it's got a little stop. You've got that piece in the center there. Everything will line up. You test that out with the axle, but basically you want this thing to be straight and tight and ready to go. There's a new seal there that's going to go in there as well. So those came out pretty nice. And then here we are putting it back together. Bolts have been cleaned up. I've got a new tube in there. New tube is a little bit different from the old tube. The old one came out through there, and there was a little piece that kind of holds it in place. These tubes are different, so I skipped that. Tires are reasonably good. Yeah, those are the nuts there that went on the old tube. So without having the threads, it's not quite the same, but I'm happy with that. And again, if somebody was doing a concourse restoration, you could probably get that same exact tube somewhere, but not something I was going to bother with. So here you can see this one is all ready to go. I'm basically going to put a few pounds of air in that tire, and boom, there you go. It looks fantastic. So this one is ready to go back on the bike at this point. Really makes a big difference. The other thing is, on the inside of that other side, you want to make sure you clean up those braking surfaces so that when you do put your new brake pads in there, that they've got something to bite. I think these came out fantastic. It's, different parts of the project, when you get something done, you say, "Ooh, geez, this is nice. Can't wait for the rest of the bike to catch up." So now we're getting down to the frame. So I decided at this point that I'm going to keep it the way that it is, although I've got to clean it and probably touch up a couple of places. And I was happy with that because the frame was actually in very good condition. And to blast this whole thing and paint it, it's just tedious. I started this project in April. I really wanted it done by the winter. And, I'm working on it a little bit here and a little bit there. So anywhere I could save some time and still have a quality result, I did. So the frame was the one thing that I left alone. And here's why I left it alone. So after a little bit of S100 and cleaning it up, it's in really good shape underneath all of that dirt and grime. So I said, based on the looks of this thing, I can leave it alone. And, a few scratches here and there. I just got a little bit of black touch-up paint and went with that. Again, kind of goes with the theme. So here we are. Just put the engine in there to see what it's going to look like. I was very happy. You can see behind there is the gas tank. I'm going to talk about the gas tank in a little bit, but at this point, the gas tank was already in primer. And now it's starting to look like a project where you're making progress as opposed to just a whole bunch of parts. Here's the forks and the top plate. So they had been spray painted. I started off by using aircraft paint stripper to get the spray paint off. It doesn't do as good a job on that original Honda paint. I mean, after 45 years or so, that paint is pretty well baked on there, but went through a couple of cycles of this, and then into the blast cabinet they go to remove the rest. So this is what it looked like after the paint stripper. And again, you can see in this case that it's removed all of the spray paint. And there's some other paint stripper I used after I ran out of the paint that I normally do. And there's a top plate, and again, all of this stuff went into the blast cabinet to be cleaned up. At this point, I hadn't done the hubs yet. What's interesting is I shot 1 million videos over the course of the last 6 months as I was working on this bike. And over the course of that same time period, lost some of them. Some of them came out poor, and I wasn't able to use them. So this is going to be a little bit out of order. But in any case, you can kind of see what I started with and what I was working with. So there's the starting point in the gas tank, right? Solid. It's been treated on the inside. Wasn't rusty, but those 2 big dents there. I pulled the dents out using a spot welder and a dent puller. And going through that process, I actually put a little hole in the front of the tank there. And the second part was kind of getting ready to be a hole. There's a restoration video on the tank that I posted. You can watch that whole thing. But basically the process was weld in the hole, fill in what's left, the little bit of the dent, fill it in with some JB weld. And I do that because it's fuel resistant. And just in case anything were to leak through there, I don't want it hitting Bondo. I figured it's better to hit JB weld, and I've done this before. And then the next step is sand that down, actual body filler, and then all of the priming and painting. So here we are again. I'm not sure why I've got this in here twice, but this is another view of what that looks like with the little bit of JB weld in the shallow parts of the dent. The dent puller I used worked pretty good. You have to be careful. These tanks are not particularly thick in the front, and I don't think pulling the dent put the little hole in it, but when I ground off what was left of it, I think I just got a little too aggressive. So here we are, a couple of coats of primer later, and you may be wondering, well, why is the tank sitting like that? I mentioned that this tank had been lined in the past. In fact, I did that myself with POR15. I love that product. It works fantastic. Of course, all of the grinding and welding and dent pulling flaked a little bit of that off on the inside, so I cleaned it up as much as I could and then went through the process of resealing it. Here's the tank after a couple of coats of candy paint. It's 2-staged, the silver and the orange, and then a failed clear coat attempt, and I was really, really disappointed at this point. If you want to see the details, watch that other video. But the clear just came out terrible, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. So what I did was I sanded all of that clear coat off very carefully, and then I used a different type of 2-part clear. And again, you've got to make sure you use the right clear because it's got to be gas resistant. And as a result of doing all of that work the second time, the tank came out fantastic, and you'll see that later on in the video. Actually, you'll see it right now. So this is with the old clear sanded off, the new clear. I think there's 2 or 3 coats on there, and it really looks good. And then those are reproduction decals that I was able to get on eBay, and boy, that just makes it pop. I was really happy this day after I got the decals on there, took it out in the sun. And again, it's really starting to look now like what I expected it to be when I started this project. And there it's sitting on my Honda Ridgeline, which I have since sold. So here's the lower fork tubes, and somewhere I have a video of taking all of these things apart, except I wasn't able to find it, but you can see stripped all the way down, cleaned out all the 50-year-old gunky grease, and put them back in. There's the forks after being painted and cleared, new fork boots, and originally I think the lower part of those forks might have been chromed, but very, very, very thin chrome. Here's the pile of what I had left to do at that point in time. One of the back fenders, I had 2 sets of fenders, but neither set was really good. My handlebars, which were a little bit bent up, tried to polish them, but didn't have a lot of luck with that. Ooh, there's the new fenders that I got. I bought a lot of the parts that I used on this project from Northeast Vintage Cycle. Great company to work with. They had a lot of this stuff in stock. They ship very, very quickly. So at this stage, oh, now we're up to the seat. Seat looked halfway decent. The pan is in good shape, a little bit rusty. The cover, I thought I was going to reuse. However, when I started to look at it, it had a couple of little holes that I hadn't noticed. So I took the whole thing apart. Here's the seat foam. Seat foam, luckily, is in really good shape. The pan, probably from sitting outside, rusted, and you'll see that in a minute. And you end up with the rust kind of embedded in the foam. Oof, that was an ugly mess, but very, very solid. So same process, bead blast it. And then I scrape off that little bit of rust from the foam so that when you put it back together, it's in better shape. And there we are, partially through that process. It really gets in there, and you probably don't have to get too crazy with it. And there's my wire brush. But I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I don't want to put it back together like that because it's just going to bother me. So very, very carefully went over that many different times to remove as much of that as I possibly can. And then I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm going to put this back together. It's going to be sitting on a seat pan that is, now painted with, I just use Rust-Oleum paint on those things. It's going to have a new cover, and it's going to sit inside my shop. It's going to be on display, so it's not going to get wet, and I'm sure it's going to last a long time. So here's that cover, a little bit pitted, but a couple of coats of both primer and paint, and it's ready for another 50 years. Of course, you're never going to see the underside of that. That plastic trim around the outside was original. It was all twisted up, and basically I just took a heat gun, heated it up very carefully, and put it back on there, and it worked out fantastic. So very happy with that. And I got the seat cover from Northeast Vintage Cycle as well. It looks really, really good. There's the heat gun that I used to get that trim back in place. And I ended up putting a little dab of glue here and there to just hold it because it just makes it that much easier to put the seat on. All right, we've jumped ahead a little bit, but there's the seat with the cover. The forks are back on the bike. There's the brand new front fender. And of course, with the fenders, I got the decals because, geez, if you're going to do this, you might as well put the decals on it. The handlebars, I ended up getting re-chromed locally, not show chrome, and it cost me about $100 to get that done, but they came out really good. I got reproduction levers. I used the cables that were on the bike when I started because somebody had replaced the cables and they were basically brand new. However, they're black. The original throttle cable was no good. Seeing 50 years worth of use. So I did get a brand new throttle cable, and as you can see there, or you saw it a minute ago, there wasn't enough throttle cable sticking out. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here's an old fender. There's the new reproduction fender, the original grommet. And again, those things are as hard as rock, but if you put a heat gun on them, they'll get back. Bingo, there's the heat gun. They come back into shape, and I just heat them up, and I pop it out of the old one, and I popped it into the new one. Use a little bit of water when you put the decals on, and push the bubbles out, and they're fantastic. So new adjusters on the back instead of fooling around with the original ones. New sprockets front and back. The chain was brand new, or very close to it, so whoever replaced the chain didn't replace the sprocket, so now that's all set. I got a new shifter on there. You can see there the foot pegs are back on the bike. Of course, bead blasted those. New rubber everywhere, so the grips are new. The foot peg rubbers are new. That makes a really big difference. And of course, the fork boots we talked about before. You can see the engine back together with the cylinder head on. Looks fantastic. I actually use socket head stainless screws when I put that together, so not original, but I like that better. And otherwise, really coming along at this point. So the last thing I did was the carburetor. Here I don't try to reuse any of the original parts. After rebuilding probably hundreds of carburetors throughout my motorcycle lifetime here, you learn what to do and not to do. I always keep all those original parts just in case. pretty clean. Only had a little bit of gasoline through it in all the years that I had it, and I try to use non-ethanol fuel. But at this point, I'm getting it ready to actually take a bath in my ultrasonic cleaner. There's the parts from the rebuild kit getting ready to go in. And there's my ultrasonic cleaner. If you do a lot of this kind of work, it's great to have one of those. That's from Sharper Tech. It's heated. The water gets really hot. I start with hot water first, and then I let it heat it up a little bit more. And the combination of hot water and the ultrasound does a really, really good job at cleaning out the inside of the carburetor. Outside, I've seen guys polish that float bowl so it looks like chrome and, really polish the carburetor. I don't do that. So there it is, ready to go back on with all the new parts. Here's the cable with the carburetor end taken off of it, because I didn't end up with enough cable, despite any adjustments, to actually have the carb slide work properly. So I had to cut about, I'm going to say, 1/4 of an inch off the end of that cable. So basically you just pull off the metal piece, you carefully cut as much as you can there. There's a little curled up, here's the wire that you have to cut off underneath that jacket. So you basically stretch that out, cut it very carefully, and then can't do it here, but push that cap back over, and then you end up with a cable that will actually work, and then your slide will go up and down the way that it's supposed to. So that was the last kind of pain in the neck job that I had to do. And finally, here we are, done in all its glory. So, 6 months worth of weekend work, a couple of long days in there. Typically the long days were nice weather during the summer when I had time. But most of this is done an hour or two at a time. And in some cases, you have to do it an hour or two at a time because, if you're painting something, you got to let it dry. The paint on the tank I let dry for a week before I cleared it. I think I'd have to go back and check now. But it really, really came out well. I'm very happy with it. And you can see in the background there was my 1974 Z50. So this is the second installment in my 1974 Honda collection. I've actually got a 74 ATC 90. But I've got, if you take a look at my other videos, there's my Honda 1974 Christmas catalog. The goal is to have each of the bikes in that catalog. And we're going to do it one at a time. But in any case, now here you can see the fuel line is missing. So I put the fuel line on it just the other day. But I was so excited to get to this point that I had to call it done. The exhaust system ended up, same thing. Blast it, paint it, new gasket going into the muffler. Of course, new gasket going into the cylinder head. And the bike is just fantastic. Original gas cap, has a little bit of patina on it. I'm very happy with that. So that's really all there is to it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're a Honda guy, and if you're an older Honda guy like me and you had one of these as a kid, I hope this brings something back. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more cool motorcycle videos. Thanks, and take care.